Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show. I thought I would start today's show with a personal note. It's been all coronavirus all the time, and yesterday I got some news which I had rather been expecting. My 89-year-old father, who was in a long-term care facility, outside Vancouver has been diagnosed with COVID-19. He's been in the facility since November. He was found driving a car on the wrong side of the road in Coquitlam, which was a strange place for him to be, given that he lives in Surrey. I thought about this and I thought, well, I don't know. We used to live there a long time ago in the 1960s. And old people often become obsessed with the past. But it's not been a very pleasant time for him. He has severe dementia, and he had to be restrained for quite a long time, strapped to his bed. He kept trying to escape. And I don't know. As I say, I was rather expecting this. And I want to thank all of the people on Twitter who have sent me appreciative notices, and particularly those who said that they would pray for him. I greatly appreciate that. I suppose there is going to be some people who are going to find this, I don't know, ironic, amusing. He says the coronavirus is a hoax, and now this has happened. Well, I've never said that it's a hoax. What I've said from the very beginning is that we have seen the data, and this is a disease which disproportionately, to put it mildly, afflicts old people, and particularly very old people. For instance, as I've pointed out several times, the average age of the long-term care home in Lynn Valley, North Vancouver, which is responsible for, a quarter of all the deaths in my province of British Columbia. The average age there is 87. One of the things I do worry about with my father is the quality of the care that he is getting. There have been numerous horror stories from Quebec and Ontario of care homes where the employees have abandoned their jobs and left their elderly patients to sit in their own waste, not be fed, that sort of thing. And I hope that is not the case with my father. There is a story here, a strange story from Global News. Quebec requests 1,000 soldiers to help in long-term care homes hit hard by coronavirus pandemic. Quebec Premier François Legault is asking for at least 1,000 soldiers from the Canadian Armed Forces to assist in long-term care facilities ravaged by the coronavirus. The request comes as the province grapples to contain outbreaks in overburdened and understaffed nursing homes. Legault said that hundreds of healthcare professionals, including 350 medical specialists, have answered the call to help, but that more assistance is needed, and that's why he is asking for more help from the military. It's not ideal, Legault said, but at the same time, I think it will help us to have more arms to carry out tasks that are not medical. Quebec's death toll has mounted to 1,134 as of Wednesday. There are 20,965 cases of COVID-19. The respiratory illness has led to 1,278 hospitalizations in Quebec. The majority of fatalities have originated in long-term care centers. The province has identified at least 80 facilities where the situation is not under control. One of my brothers gave me the news yesterday, and he told me that the lesson, or one of the lessons from COVID-19, is not to end up in a long-term care facility. And I think he's absolutely right about that. You are being looked after by people who in very many cases don't seem to care for their patients, and in some actively hate them and seek to make their lives worse. I'm kind of curious as to, how this facility that my father's in, how the coronavirus managed to get in there. Given the scandal in North Vancouver, one would have thought that these places would be taking stringent measures to prevent the spread of coronavirus. But there you have it. I've mentioned Christopher Ferrara of the Remnant before, and he's in a rather similar situation to me. He wrote yesterday, as followers of this series will know, my father, Joseph, age 96, has tested positive for the Wuhan virus. He received the diagnosis on Good Friday in the midst of a statewide coronavirus lockdown of his VA nursing facility in Paramus, New Jersey. My sister and I were barred from visiting him until April the 17th, when my sister was informed that family members would now be allowed a compassionate visit, as my father had been transferred to the COVID ward, which is considered an end-of-life scenario. Fear of contagion was suddenly no longer a concern, and we would be permitted to see him, but only to send him off. But after a 6-hour drive from Richmond, during which my father received last rites and the apostolic pardon, I entered his room in the requisite mask and rubber gloves to encounter not the final stages of a terminal case of COVID-19, but rather something I had seen before. My dear father in a state of acute, life-threatening dehydration with a related infection. During the lockdown, he had been deprived of family advocacy and support, including the supplemental water my sister had provided him during their daily visits to prevent the dehydration to which he is highly susceptible. By the time of our visit on the 17th, the nursing staff found that they could no longer successfully insert an IV for fluids, and an emergency transfer to a nearby hospital was required. The father I love, whom I regard as a living saint, had been reduced to complete prostration without the help of a family member who could have forestalled this complication. Following his admission to the hospital with an admitting diagnosis of dehydration, the hospital's PICC team were able to insert a line to provide fluids. My father's condition stabilized, but he is far from out of the woods. He may well not survive this crisis. But as with the nursing facility, family supportive visits are forbidden by order of the state, unless the hospital lockdown also results in an end-of-life scenario. Once again, we cannot visit to support and advocate for our father, but only to send him off once his condition is deemed terminal. Such senseless cruelty toward the elderly victims of this virus. Yet their battle with the virus is no different in essence from that of elders who were allowed family visits during prior flu epidemics in New Jersey, my father included. Many of those elders died of the flu, including many in my father's own facility, long before the Wuhan virus made its appearance. If it be God's will, my father will survive, if not a death that might have been prevented by assistance from family, including something as simple as a few glasses of water each day, will be added to the COVID-19 death statistics that have fueled the panic narrative over a flu-like illness Democrat politicians and the lying media have been exploiting in a psychopathic attempt to burn down the country so that Trump will have no prospect of re-election. And then he goes on to say that the great deception is unraveling and may be nearing its end. He quotes Professor Yitzhak Ben Israel of Tel Aviv University. The numbers told a shocking story, irrespective of whether the country quarantined like Israel or went about business as usual like Sweden. Coronavirus peaked and subsided in the exact same way. His graphs show that all countries experienced seemingly identical coronavirus infection patterns, with the number of infected peaking in the 6th week and rapidly subsiding by the 8th week. The Wuhan virus follows its own pattern. It is a fixed pattern that is not dependent on freedom or quarantine. There is a decline in the number of infections even in countries without closures, and it is similar to the countries with closures. He talks about the studies in California, which I've talked about previously. And he continues, in fact, I'm fairly certain that I myself had the Wuhan virus during the Latin Mass magazine conference in Monterey in late February. Near the epicenter of California's outbreak, I developed nausea, a slight fever, slight chills, and violent vomiting for a whole night, followed by fatigue for several days, as did several others in attendance. But later I read that my most unusual symptom, a temporary loss of taste and smell, is a key marker for COVID-19. As I have said previously, it is my belief as well that I had this late last year where I was pretty much out. Well, I was in very bad shape for about a week. And by very bad shape, I mean that I was constantly coughing and exhausted. I will talk a little later about the skepticism of the panic. But as far as these care homes go, there's going to be criminal investigations of this. Are there not? I mean, one expects a certain duty of care. You know, I understand that people 89 years old, like my father, or 95 years old, like Christopher Ferrera's father, are close to death at all times. But that does not mean that they should be treated cruelly, or that the ordinary work of keeping them hydrated, say, or keeping them clean is ignored. So I want to do, well, let's go to the chat first. Okay. Chokin666 says, yes, every Karen and manager is having a field day playing hall monitor with this mask theater BS. Vox Days, D-A-Z-E, says Stephen Molyneux's father died a few days ago. Vigil Doc Purple Heart says sexual abuse is out of control in those snake pit old age homes. Vox Days, again, I live in an assisted living facility which houses about 65 to 70 apartments. I'm only 63, but most are in their 80s to 90s. Chogan King 666 says, we must end this warehousing of the elderly. I don't, you know, there's a lot of jokes on television and the movies about, you know, children looking for any opportunity to stick their parents in an old age home. That was one of the jokes at the beginning of The Simpsons. But I suppose it's considered very unusual now for the aged to live with any of their children. I rather suspect that there's a lack of interest in people finding out what actually goes on in these places, because people in the media say others, they don't really want to know, because it would be too distressing. Someone's complaining about buffering of the stream. Okay, so let's talk about Alex Berenson. I've mentioned him quite a few times, daily, I suppose, on this live stream, and he has become rather famous, but it turns out that he has greatly offended the science cultists. They call him a crank. They say he shouldn't be writing on this subject because he is not an expert. But of course, the people who are making the decisions are not the experts. Trudeau, Trump, Boris Johnson, they all say that they're listening to the experts, but of course, they are responsible for the decisions that are made because they are elected and the experts are not elected. This is from Fox News. A former New York Times reporter, Alex Berenson, who has openly questioned the models guiding the government's response to the coronavirus crisis, told Fox News' Brit Hume that the New York-based anti-Trump media is part of the problem. Brit Hume has come out against the COVID-19 panic. I suppose he would be the most senior journalist to have done so. But you see, part of the problem here is that, I mean, there's no question that the media and the Democrats are using COVID-19 as a cudgel with which they hope to force Trump out of office. They're not even bothering to hide it anymore. And so at the very least, Alex Berenson has been found guilty of being insufficiently never Trump. Berenson told Hume that the media is partially responsible for people not listening to studies, he says, indicate measures taken to combat the spread of coronavirus have been overblown. You really have to ask yourself, is this nearly as dangerous as we were told it was? Not that. Again, not that it isn't real, not that it can't hurt people, especially, elderly people and people with comorbidities, Berenson said, but it is dangerous in a way that justifies what we have done to our society, and he disagrees. I should mention that my own father has quite a few comorbidities, including COPD. Hume then asked why the former Times reporter, who in his time with the paper from 1999 to 2010 primarily covered the pharmaceutical industry, seems like the lonely voice making that case. And he responded, I sort of have two thoughts on that. One is that obviously the media is very, very New York centric. And what happened in New York is exceptional. New York doesn't look like anywhere else in the United States. Both in terms of its population density, its reliance on mass transit, and clearly what happened in the city in late March was bad. A lot of people did die. We don't quite know how many yet. But a lot of people died, and that scared a lot of people. And in New York, people are locked up in their apartments. But the other reason is, and unfortunately, I think this has become a bigger part of it in the last couple of weeks, is that a lot of people hate Donald Trump. He repeated a lot of people in the media hate Donald Trump and said he is a registered independent himself. It's clear that many people in the media who don't like Donald Trump on some level blame him for everything that's happened. He said the media's tendency to blame the president shaded almost into, we're not going to recognize that maybe this isn't as terrible as we thought it was a month ago. Berenson then evoked his former employer, the paper that President Trump often mocks as the failing New York Times. The New York Times, where I worked for 10 years and I loved working, could have written everything they wrote about New York City and how terrible things were in New York and still presented a much more balanced picture of what was going on in the rest of the United States, and they didn't do it, and I don't know why. He said it's disturbing to witness media groupthink related to the coronavirus pandemic and wants to reach as many people as possible. All I want is for the right policy measures to be undertaken, and if I can kind of get information to people who are getting a totally, or largely incorrect picture from places like the Times and CNN, and I can do that with data, then I'll do it. So, yes, media groupthink. Let's get some media groupthink. This is from Forbes 4 days ago. Alex Berenson has been in the news this week as the king of COVID-19 contrarians, Vanity Fair, the right's favorite coronavirus truther, Vice. These headlines followed various and sundry appearances on Fox News, prompting additional Fox coverage of Alex's clashes with the mainstream media. I went to college with Alex, and we were friendly. As Alex blew up this week, an email chain with my college roommates reminisced about him, attempting to recall whom he hung out with. Dave, did he hang around with the Yale Daily News crowd? Ryan, no way, he was never in that crowd. Dave, what crowd was he in? He must have been in crowds all of the time because he seems to hate social distancing. Ha, 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 ha. Fox identifies Alex as a former New York Times reporter, but Fox conveniently omits Alex's subsequent success as a fiction writer, 12 John Wells spy novels, prompting Vice to sarcastically identify Alex as the world's foremost former New York Times reporter. Journalists are an envious lot, a jealous lot, and they're also a bitchy lot. And who is this Alex Berenson, and why are people taking him seriously? Alex is far from the first skeptic of what we're hearing about COVID from medical doctors, researchers, and public health professionals. He follows in the proud tradition of his Fox interlocutor, Hannity, as well as White House trade advisor Peter Navarro, who told CNN that his qualifications in terms of looking at the science is that I'm a social scientist. What these gentlemen have in common is that none has a STEM education. Alex majored in economics and history, and of course, those two disciplines are completely useless in terms of understanding a pandemic. I don't have a STEM background either, so I'm not going to delve into the details of the tenuous and much derided claims they're making, let alone repeat them. But I do know this: education and expertise matter a lot, and a time like this can be the difference between life and death. Well, people are dying of COVID. They are dying of other things as well, in greater numbers and greatly elevated numbers because of the COVID-19 panic. The Forbes author continues, if I have any experience and it's in education, yeah, that is not at all a soft subject. So the hullabaloo over Alex reminds us that colleges and universities aren't doing nearly enough to prioritize STEM education in their academic programs. Of course, the objective isn't to keep alumni from making public statements about epidemiology that are patently wrong. Most professionals with STEM degrees haven't taken coursework in epidemiology. But in an age of unparalleled scientific and technical progress and challenges, an adequate STEM education helps students understand and circumscribe the limits of what they know while providing a healthy respect for real expertise. Yes, the cult of expertise. How about Dr. Anthony Fauci? Whoa, the sainted Dr. Fauci. Again, I will remind you that during the 1980s, he was famous. Not as famous as he has become, but he was famous because of AIDS. And AIDS, oh my God, it was everyone's disease, and the number of heterosexuals that were going to die, it was just going to be shocking. And that didn't happen. These people with STEM degrees who are coming out with these models have been already proved, in this case, to have been grossly incorrect. And in many other panics, which they fomented, foot and mouth disease for animals and its transmission to people in Britain is another example of where they were grossly wrong. Oh, let's go to Vice and Laura Wagner. Here are the questions the right's favorite coronavirus truther isn't willing to answer. Truther? Oh, you mean like 9/11? Okay. No one is disputing that coronavirus and COVID-19 exist. The dispute is over what are the proper public policy measures to be implemented. So it's really not like 9/11 truthers. Yes, Alex Berenson, the world's foremost former New York Times reporter. Ha 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 ha. He is also one of the world's foremost coronavirus truthers. He has spent the last month or so tweeting nearly nonstop about what he sees as coronavirus fear-mongering, government's overreactions to the pandemic, and media's failure to ask the tough questions that he, and he alone, is smart and brave enough to ask. Why do people hate the media? Well, here's an example. Alex Berenson has not claimed that he and he alone is smart enough and brave enough to ask these questions. There are other people, including many certified experts and top epidemiologists, who are speaking much as Alex Berenson is. Wagner continues that Berenson is evidently convinced that the measures being used to prevent the spread of coronavirus are plunging America into authoritarianism and routinely chastises other reporters for spreading misinformation. When people are literally locked into their houses, what other word than authoritarianism comes to mind? When Chinese drones are being used to track scofflaws, yes, again, the word authoritarianism comes to mind. So what happened here is that this woman from Vice wanted to interview him. Now, I mean, my recommendation would be no sane person would give an interview to Vice, and or the mainstream media as a whole. They're not going to be fair. They're not interested in the truth, and they're not interested in providing a forum for dissenting views. So she sent an email to Berenson. Hi, Alex. I'm a reporter with Vice, and I'm interested in doing a Q&A with you about your coronavirus work. Your positions on COVID and COVID guidelines have certainly struck a nerve with many people, and I think a straightforward Q&A where you can lay out where and how the media has biffed coverage of the coronavirus, and I can ask you follow-up questions about it, would be legitimately useful for our readers. I am envisioning a fairly free-flowing discussion. Is this something you would be interested? Thanks, Laura Wagner. Berenson responded, I'm very short on time. If you want to ask questions over email, I will try to answer them, but only on the condition you don't do it Chotiner style and annotate or second-guess me after I have answered. In other words, it would have to be the equivalent of a live on-air interview. You ask, I answer. That's the end of it. I agreed to run the Q&A verbatim and send him a list of 12 questions. I had no way of knowing that Berenson, purportedly a journalist himself, was also trying to bar me from asking follow-up questions with his very specific conditions. What, you can't read English, Laura Wagner? I did not and would not agree to these terms. The next day, I emailed to ask when I could expect his answers, and yesterday morning he sent them. I read his responses, formulated follow-up questions, and sent them back. He was not happy with that. He responded, sorry, not what we agreed to. Run it as is with the original questions and answers, or kill it. And so there was some back and forth. Berenson said, you have my answers. I was very clear on the terms of the interview. If you do anything but run them in one long single Q&A with no additional commentary, I will just publish this email chain when you run them, and people can judge for themselves whether you acted in good faith. So she didn't do that. She has her gotchas, her responses to him, her follow-up questions, and she made a deal. She made an agreement with Alex Berenson and wasted his time, and then broke the agreement. And she is now, I don't know, posing as some sort of hero of journalism, as the queen, the yes, slay queen of the fact checkers. So Rich Lowry, who's the editor of National Review, responded, I don't agree with Alex Berenson on the underlying policy, but I don't get why it's supposed to be an outrage that he agreed to answer questions via email, answered them cogently, and they didn't want to deal with tendentious follow-ups. She responded, the editor of the National Review, thinking that basic fact-checking and follow-up questions are tendentious, does explain some things, ... She broke the agreement, and I don't know, perhaps she's just particularly obtuse, and she doesn't understand. She doesn't understand English, you know? And I've never heard of this woman before, but she does not sound like a reliable person. Someone named Alex Martin responded, hi, Laura Wags. We met yesterday all over on Brian Stelter's page. You recall that Brian Stelter crawled into bed weeping a couple of days ago. I just looked at your article on Alex Berenson. Seems neat, but I just don't have the attention span to get through all of the words. It's long. So I have a favor to ask. Instead of trying to read and comprehend all of the points in your article so I can develop my own thoughtful question and response, I'm wondering if you could save me some time by answering a set of questions via email. And then, yes, he goes on to say that, he will do to her what she did to Berenson. So David Friedlander wrote a piece about Berenson for Vanity Fair. And Vanity Fair, what does it do? There's a lot of ads for expensive clothing and the like. And there's the occasional good piece, but it is mostly hagiography. The celebrities, they're just so wonderful. Just so wonderful. He wrote on Twitter, for Vanity Fair, I wrote about Alex Berenson, the investigative reporter turned spy novelist, turned marijuana alarmist, turned now COVID-19 truther. There's that word again. Truther. So, if you disagree with public policy measures taken on COVID-19, I don't know, what does that make you? Does it make you a lunatic? Does it make you perhaps an anti-Semite or whatever? COVID-19 denier. We've heard that as well. Berenson wrote a book about marijuana, which concluded that marijuana was a dangerous drug and that legalization of it was a bad idea and is particularly important to keep it away from children. This makes him a marijuana alarmist. So he's a spy novelist. John le Carre, real name David Cornwell, is a spy novelist too. Would David Friedlander mock John le Carre for this? Yossi Gestetner responded, "Truther, Alex Berenson is merely keeping track of data and pointing out what they are doing wrong based on outcome. Everyone covering COVID should be doing this rather than being parrots for models." And so there's the Vanity Fair piece. And it begins, does the king of the COVID-19 contrarians have a case? Which suggests that there's going to be a fair discussion. No, there is not. Berenson declined to be interviewed for this story. He said he would answer factual questions over email, but then he said he was too busy for even that and sent along a statement instead. Well, that was clever of him. Mr. Friedlander, I don't know you, and it is possible you plan to write an entirely fair piece about me. However, given last week's Vanity Fair article on me, I have no reason to believe so, and I do not have time to engage in a dance with you. My focus right now is trying to figure out what is really happening in and to hospitals and families and businesses nationally, and whether the course of action we have chosen makes any sense. My goal is to provide policymakers and everyone else with accurate and truthful information that for whatever reason they are not receiving elsewhere. But public health experts presented with Berenson's views disputed his recent analysis, such as COVID-19 presenting little risk to young people. There are millions of people, of young people who would be at risk, said Greg Gonsalves, assistant professor of epidemiology at the Yale School of Medicine. And models, boy, wow, the fans of models do not like people who are skeptical of models. Models are not crystal balls, Gonsalves said. A modeler is giving you a range of potential outcomes. What he is doing is what a lot of people who don't understand science do. They take the uncertainty built into a model and say, oh, well, it shows these people don't know what they're talking about. He is playing with scientific uncertainty in order to say, see, I know what is right here. He is somebody with a messianic complex. And to be clear, all of the models say this is going to be one of the worst epidemics we have ever faced. Another expert from the Yale School of Medicine, Joseph Vinitz, MD, disputed Berenson's contention that the healthcare system in the US isn't under strain. Why is this guy even getting any oxygen? Oh, yes, you see, we can't have dissent. We can't have dissent. Let's talk about scientific uncertainty. Well, in terms of who should be heard and who shouldn't be heard, well, there certainly isn't any uncertainty there. Vinitz went on to say he should stick to his novel writing. He should go back to school and learn some science. Friends and former colleagues say that Berenson genuinely believes in what he is doing. You see that subtle little dig there? Oh, I'm not saying that he's a fraud, you know. I'm not saying that he's a deliberate liar. He's just wrong. Oh, they also see a guy cast out of his old media world. He quit the New York Times to write best-selling #1 New York Times paperback books. Oh, he lives in the upstate media enclave of Garrison, New York. Oh, we're going to pick fights with people based on where they live? Well, let's start with Brooklyn, New York. And playing to his newfound friends on the right, a trajectory that began with his contrarian book last year on marijuana, Tell Your Children. Yes, we're all convinced that marijuana is just so wonderful. Former colleagues speak of someone who has a significant ego and a sense of embattlement. Are there any journalists out there that don't have a significant ego? You know, setting the world to rights, which is what journalists do these days, that takes an ego. But no, I'm sure the Friedlander, he doesn't have a significant ego. No. One former business reporter who wrote in a text that after the marijuana book came out, Berenson got all defensive and convinced himself that the politically correct were trying to silence him for having different opinions. Well, you know, when you use words like alarmist and truther, that does suggest that the politically correct were trying to silence him for having different opinions. Oh, let's see, Rush Limbaugh praised him, and that's very, very bad. You know, you can't have that. Let's see, his spy books have become bestsellers and garnered Berenson an Edgar Award for the Mystery Writers of America, even as some reviewers chafed at the book's apparent endorsement of torture and their graphic depictions of violence. Yes, a Vanity Fair, shrinking violets there. Ooh, violence. No, we can't have that in literature. Come. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, that's enough of this. So Jason Richwine at National Review wrote a piece, and I think I know what happened. That Rich Lowry was so annoyed with his treatment from Laura Wagner, that he said, okay, I don't believe in this Berenson fellow, but I'm going to get someone to write a piece to defend him. So Richwine writes, people whose expertise has been questioned often respond in ways that further alienate the skeptics. A good illustration comes from Vanity Fair's profile of Alex Berenson, a leading advocate of the view that lockdowns are too strict. Berenson was one of the first journalists to point out that the IHME model, on which so many states relied, drastically overestimated hospitalizations, even after multiple revisions, and even after taking the effect of lockdowns into account. So that he quotes what I just quoted on the subject of models from Greg Gonsalves. And Richwine says, note the arrogant tone, the name-calling, and the argument from authority. This is how Professor Gonsalves intends to win over the skeptics. It's not even clear what his point is. Yes, all predictive models have uncertainty, but it follows that the more uncertain the model, the less useful its predictions are. That should not be controversial. Furthermore, IHME has underestimated its own uncertainty. Although I am a mere policy analyst, I do know that when IHME offers 95% prediction intervals, then the actual values are supposed to fall outside those intervals only 5% of the time. Applying that standard, critics investigated how the IHME model has performed on what should have been one of its easiest tasks, predicting the number of deaths that will occur the very next day. They found that over a 4-day period, the actual number of next-day deaths in each state fell outside of the model's 95% interval about 2/3 of the time. The failure is self-evident. One need not have a messianic complex to reject this model's predictions. Finally, even if all the models say this is going to be one of the worst epidemics, that is hardly the end of the policy debate. It can be simultaneously true that we face a terrible epidemic and that full lockdowns are an overreaction. The real issue is how far our mitigation attempts can go before they are no longer worth the economic and social costs. Even people who understand science might conclude that those attempts have already got too far. So then he quotes from what I quoted on Joseph Vinetz, saying, why is he getting any oxygen? Should stick to his novel writing, should learn some science. Richwine comments, nothing from Dr. Vinetz's quote conflicts with Berenson's positions. Most hospitals are far from overflowing. They have more flexibility than expected, and non-COVID-19 patients should be encouraged to return so that beds don't go unused. Nevertheless, Dr. Vinetz felt the need to throw in not one, but two gratuitous insults. Why react to skepticism with hostility rather than reason? Perhaps it's just human nature. People become invested in their own work. They come to believe their critics are not just wrong, but dangerous, and they end up lashing out in frustration. Still, if the goal is to bring skeptics to their side, this is exactly the wrong way to do it. Well, that is not the goal. The goal is to silence skeptics. And I'm going to Berenson's own Twitter feed here. And as I say, Rick Hume becomes, as far as I know, the first major media figure with serious credibility to say it. Time to consider the possibility that coronavirus lockdown was a colossal public policy calamity. Wait, did the CDC director just say the second wave of SARS-CoV-2 may be much worse because it might happen during flu season? Quote, we're going to have the flu epidemic and the coronavirus epidemic at once, unquote. Doesn't this implicitly suggest, oh, never mind? And the sheriff of Snohomish County, Washington, with 800,000 people, 10% of Washington's population, will no longer enforce the state's stay-at-home order. Quote, the impacts of COVID-19 no longer warrant the suspension of our constitutional rights. John Levine asked Siri, why has trust in media declined? And he presents two tweets. The first from Jonathan Chait, a sad, loving Ginia New York Times portrait of a man killed by Fox News. New York Times headline, a beloved bar owner was skeptical about the virus. Then he took a cruise. He was killed by Fox News. And here's a tweet, February 27th, from the same Ginia Belafonte. I fundamentally don't understand the panic. Incidence of the disease is declining in China. Virus is not deadly in vast majority of cases. Production and so on will slow down and will obviously rebound. Now, there are already hundreds or thousands of such examples of people saying the opposite of what they were saying shortly beforehand and pretending they didn't say it. Well, this has been screen capped. So it's too late for Ginia Belafonte in that regard, just as it's too late for Maggie Haberman of the New York Times and many others. Is that going to stop them? No. No, it's not. Here's a story from the Off Guardian, Coronavirus Lockdown and What You Are Not Being Told, Part 2 by Ian Davis. He says, in Part 1, we looked at the reasons why questioning the coronavirus lockdown, despite the ever-present allegation, does not demonstrate a callous disregard for human life. We're going to expand on why it doesn't in this article. I'm based in the UK, so much of this discussion relates to the decisions of the British state, but this is a global policy agenda and similar policies are found across the developed world. Effectively, a small group of policy decision makers have placed an estimated 3.5 billion people under house arrest. It is only possible for them to do so with our consent. Consent is carefully cultivated by controlling the information we are given, or as Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman famously put it, manufactured consent. For the vast majority, their only source of information is the corporate mainstream media, MSM, and the public announcements of the state. We're going to look at evidence which strongly suggests the state and the MSN, adhering to the globalist agenda, have colluded to mislead the public into believing the COVID-19 threat is far greater than it actually is. COVID-19 can be fatal for those with pre-existing comorbidities and possibly even some without, as can other forms of pneumonia and influenza-like respiratory illness. However, while every COVID-19 death has been reported, none of the far greater number of people who have died in the UK this year from other respiratory infections have even been mentioned. Systems have been created to ensure the COVID-19 statistics are as terrifying as possible. Their statistical product is so vague it borders upon meaningless. It seems we have been inculcated with misplaced fear to justify the lockdown regime, to convince us to accept it and prepare us for what is to come. And he talks about the WHO, which is financed through a combination of assessed and voluntary contributions. Assessed contributions are paid by nation states. Voluntary contributions are additional contributions from member states and other partners. For some reason, these figures haven't been reported for more than 3 years. About 80% of the WHO's finances come from voluntary contributions. In its most recent 2017 voluntary contribution report, the WHO accounted for the $2.1 billion it received from private foundations and global corporations. This compared to just over $1 billion voluntarily provided by governments. Contributors included GlaxoSmithKline, Bayer AG, Sanofi, Merck, and Gilead Sciences, whose drug remdesivir is currently being trialed alongside the off-patent hydroxychloroquine as a possible preventive treatment for COVID-19. The third largest single contributor in 2017 was Gavi, formerly called the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. They contributed nearly 134 million. Gavi are partnered with the WHO, UNICEF, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the World Bank to sell vaccines globally. The World Bank contributed nearly 146 million themselves, and the largest individual payment by some margin at nearly 325 million came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Among other beneficiaries of the BMGF's generosity are the Vaccine Impact Modeling Consortium, led by Professor Neil Ferguson. They are based at Imperial College London and are directly funded by the BMGF and Gavi. Their objective is to provide statistical data analysis in order for them to sell more vaccines. Professor Ferguson not only led the team who created the hopelessly inaccurate prediction, which the US and UK governments based their lockdown regimes upon, but he also co-founded the MRC Center for Outbreak Analysis and Modeling, who worked with the WHO in 2009 to create ridiculous computer models predicting the H1N1 pandemic. The WHO, in that year, declared H1N1 a pandemic. This resulted in billions being spent on very expensive H1N1 vaccines and antiviral treatments, although it turned out the pandemic was indistinguishable from seasonal flu. The only people who benefited from pointless vaccines and unnecessary medication were the manufacturers GlaxoSmithKline, Roche, and Novartis. Each of these pharmaceutical corporations were among the largest voluntary contributors to the WHO in 2008-2009. With an $84 million investment, the Swiss pharmaceutical giant Roche was the largest single contributor to the WHO's coffers that year. Luckily, as it turned out, they could afford it because sales of their unnecessary Tamiflu H1N1 medication rocketed to more than £3 billion following the WHO's declared H1N1 pandemic, which was just a coincidence. The whole debacle resulted in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe launching an investigation into the WHO to look into the issue of a, quote, falsified pandemic, unquote. During the subsequent hearing, the epidemiologist, Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg, said, the WHO basically held the trigger for the pandemic preparedness plans. They had a key role to play in deciding on the pandemic. About $18 billion was spent on this pandemic worldwide. Millions were vaccinated for no good reason. It is not even clear that the vaccine had a positive effect because it was not clinically tested. At the same hearing, Professor Dr. Ulrich Keil, director of the WHO Collaborating Center for Epidemiology at the University of Munster, said, a number of scientists and others are questioning the decision of the WHO to declare an international pandemic. The H1N1 virus is not a new virus, but has been known to us for decades. In Germany, about 10,000 deaths are attributed to seasonal flu, especially among older and frail people. Only a very small number of deaths, namely 187, can be attributed to the H1N1 virus in Germany, and many of those are dubious. Of course, nothing came of it because Pace was making allegations against the World Health Organization. The WHO don't break the rules, they make the rules. This is a very long article, which I commend to you, which you can find at off-guardian.org. So Paul Joseph Watson, who is also in the UK, writes for Summit News, we were told lockdown and social distancing were necessary to return to normal. Fair enough. Now they're telling us we may never return to normal. Then what have we been doing for the past month? That is an excellent question. I suspect, again, this is an experiment. It is a kind of controlled burn of population, of getting people used to the idea that, I don't know, going to a long-term care facility is by necessity a death sentence, getting people used to the idea that no, jobs, that was the old world. No, you get your check from the government, and you better stay on good terms with the government because that check, it might be delayed. or it might be canceled, if you engage in anti-social speech. That is to say, if you question governmental decisions. These are trying times, to be sure. William Briggs has an amusing entry today. It's called the Peak Coronavirus Idiocy Contest. Number one, in the era of coronavirus and social distancing, should you go to a tornado shelter? An article from the Weather Channel which asks which death is superior, almost certainly being crushed to gooey particles by a rampaging tornado, or the mere possibility of coughing up your lungs strapped to a gurney. They opt for being sucked to Oz. Dr. Fauci, I can't guarantee it will be safe to physically vote at the polls in November. Mad Doctor believes people might follow his advice to cower under their beds for 7 more months. Or maybe he's finding a way to encourage people to vote for Biden. That assumes Biden still remembers he's running for president, of course. We've seen this ad. It's not made up. The Biden ad. It says, Joe Biden, not his brain, his heart. And there's a little light from his heart. So, he may be stupid, but he has a big heart. He may be senile, but he has a big heart. Vote for Joe Biden. Non-compliant business loses business license in Hollister. In San Benito County, code enforcement has been checking on businesses to make sure they're following the county's health order. According to county officials, 9 businesses have been investigated and deemed non-essential, leading them to close their doors until the stay-at-home order is lifted. In one case, a business did not comply with the request to close, even though it was deemed non-essential and its business license was revoked by the city of Hollister. Government to citizens, screw you. Also government to citizens, we'll save you. A vocal set, U.S. conservatives who detest climate models add a new target, coronavirus models. A vocal set of conservative critics in America have upped their attacks recently on the data modeling behind the coronavirus response, and they claim, despite scientific evidence to the contrary, that the flaws also prove the limits of climate change forecasts. The group, which includes federal lawmakers, climate science deniers, and conservative pundits with close White House connections, has even called for congressional hearings into the coronavirus modeling. That's in spite of assurances from public health officials that better than expected U.S. death estimates for COVID-19 are because millions of Americans responded to pleas for social distancing. The most used model now forecasts 60,000 U.S. deaths rather than 100,000 or more, unquote. It's not a surprise they're beginning to tie failed epidemiological models to failed climate models and calling skeptics deniers in each instance. The practical definition of denier, given its actual uses, must be one who does his best to speak the truth. Doubt this? See the next entry. How COVID-19 could ruin weather forecasts and climate records. Climate models are lousy because of coronavirus. You just had to see that one coming. Why we can't trust warm weather to stop coronavirus. Or why we must throw away all evidence from past pandemics in order to maintain our level of fear. Whatever you do, don't go out in the virus-killing sunshine and germicidal air. You might discover you don't need government as much as you thought you did. Plan A for the coronavirus, in which Moldbug sells his soul by calling for rule by experts, because credentialed, joins the left in calling ordinary Americans deplorables, and calls for tyranny to take away his fear of dying from coronavirus. Proposed bill would provide Americans with $2,000 a month until employment returns to pre-COVID-19 levels. The brilliance of this idiocy is breathtaking. The government first throws everybody out of work, then prints money to pay them for being out of work. They create the problem to solve it. Hello, inflation. Hello, prolonged unemployment. Yes, who wins? I think a good case can be made for both 1 and 5, but 8 takes the same cake Marie Antoinette wanted her subjects to eat in absence of bread, or takes the ice cream Nancy Pelosi has specially flown in. The government causes the problem and then solves it by making it worse, all the while never learning the lesson that it never should have acted in the first place. No lessons will be learned. The connection between COVID-19, the COVID-19 panic, and the climate emergency, climate extinction panic, they're instructive because despite all the politicians, the elite, the experts saying the oceans were going to start to boil anytime soon, and we had, 11 years to fix this, or else it was game over, it just didn't seem to scare all that many people. And again, David Mamet said, you just issue a press release. Boy, this is the government, and the government has experts. You don't disagree with the government, do you? Wait a minute. I thought you were all about resistance. No, that was good resistance. This is bad resistance. Donald Trump is a bad man because he wants to give Americans back their civil rights. I mean, that should be fairly easy to understand. Laura Perrins tweets, we need a lockdown to flatten the curve. Then, can't lift lockdown because there could be a second wave. Then, can't lift lockdown until we have a vaccine. Then, can't lift lockdown until we have enough vaccines. I'm getting the United States is a little different, but in the rest of the Western world, I'm getting the impression that this lockdown, or some variant of it, is intended to last forever. Because flatten the curve. Okay, the curve has been well flattened. So let's get life back to normal. No, that cannot happen. Of course, Dr. Fauci, who thinks that the handshake is finished, thinks it's perfectly acceptable to go onto Grindr and find another man for anonymous sodomy. Nothing unhealthy about that. Oh, how about the true conservatives? What do the true conservatives think of this? Well, the true conservatives are also never Trump, so I guess you can figure it out. S.E. Cup, or Size E. Cup, who works for CNN, she said the Trump administration, she quoted from Bill Barr, the Trump administrations and states are struggling and at times fighting with each other over the best approach to deal with the crisis. Enter Bill Barr to make it worse. Well, Bill Barr said that, America does have a constitution, does have a Bill of Rights. Americans have certain rights which are guaranteed to them, and that states which insist upon taking rights away, basic rights away from Americans, that he would jawbone first, and then he would look at amicus curiae briefs in support of lawsuits against the states. So in other words, Bill Barr is in favor of liberty, freedom, and we can't have that. That's not truly conservative. So what does liberty mean to the true conservatives? Nothing. Are you surprised? You shouldn't be. They're contemptible phonies. Matt Walsh has a piece on the Daily Wire. I drove to an essential grocery store this weekend to buy some essential food. On the way, I noticed that Best Buy was still open. I also passed a Dunkin' Donuts and a Dairy Queen that were still open and packed with customers in their drive-through lanes. Apparently, donuts, ice cream, and TVs are all considered essential, which I suppose doesn't surprise me, nor do I necessarily disagree. They have all been certainly essential elements of my own life. But it does raise a question about what the government actually means when it declares a business essential, thus allowing it to stay open, or inessential, thus shutting its doors and possibly driving it into irretrievable ruin. I'm not arguing that the stores mentioned above, or for the matter liquor stores or any other business that our benevolent overlords have permitted to remain operational should be closed. I'm happy that they are open. My point is that every other business should be open too. The government system of designating something essential or inessential is arbitrary, unjust, often absurd, and subjective. And I doubt it is a coincidence that wealthy and politically connected businesses have so often fallen into the essential category, while small businesses with little money and no connections have been wiped out. Now, if the term essential has any objective meaning when applied to a business, it must be that an essential business is one which people depend on for survival. I don't think anyone is going to die without Dunkin' Donuts or Best Buy, but the former sells food and the latter sells things that customers might need in order to work and communicate. If we take a very broad and generous view of the phrase depend on, then I can see how these two businesses fit the bill. But then every business fits the bill. Every business has people depending on it. Even if it is expendable as far as the customers are concerned, it certainly isn't expendable to the employees and their families. This is why every business, in a very real and urgent sense, is essential to someone. It is obviously ludicrous to suggest that Walmart and Target are essential to me, but my job and my income are not essential to me. Indeed, the essentialness of a product is irrelevant if I don't have the money to buy it, which means my income is always more fundamentally essential than anything I might find at any store. Let's go back to the chat. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. Oh dear, a sad story from Mont D. Law. David Wright says nursing homes, long-term care are both different from assisted living. Alex DeLarge says they're mostly horrible places. And again, as I mentioned a little while ago, well, I don't think they became horrible places overnight. I think it's likely they've been horrible places for quite some time. But people did not really want to make a fuss about this because the implications were too horrifying. Let's see, Chokin King 666 says, I acted as a home hospice care for my mom. Unfortunately, my dad was in Florida and it was close to impossible to get him to New York. Half Galician says, didn't Joe Rogan and Berenson go toe-to-toe over the ganja? Well, we know that Joe Rogan certainly likes his Goofenthal. Laramie Hirsch, news, various groups within traditional Catholic circles are attacking the SSPX through different vectors. This time they're dredging up old accusations of priest abuse. I saw a reference to that on Marette Cayley. It's curious why it would be this time that they'd go after the SSPX. Philip Daniel says, scientists in related but distinct disciplines often disagree on basic questions. The hard sciences settled my arse. Laramie Hirsch, the action of attacking the only priest delivering the sacraments during this pandemic is starting to show just whose side such attackers are on. Yes, Half Galician says that Rush calls him Il Fauci. Yeah, okay. Never leave the keyboard. MCT says, at the end, my father requested to be taken to a local hospital. They'll kill me quicker, he said. He was a fervent cynic and my best friend. I miss him daily. These types cannot even fathom that they may be incorrect. Well, it is truly the argument from authority that you can point out with regard to Imperial College, for instance, that they've been wrong again and again and disastrously wrong, but they remain the authority. Contra Coup says the models have been off by more than 2 orders of magnitude. I don't know why the media is not admitting this, because they would have to admit that they were wrong twice. Because the initial line from the media, following the line from the WHO, following the line from the Chinese Communist Party, not a big deal. Typical flu. In fact, we don't even know that it can be communicated person to person, shutting down flights from China, xenophobia, stigmatizing, etc. Then they saw this as an opportunity to take down Trump, and suddenly we're all gonna die. And if it turns out we're not all gonna die, then the journalists would have to admit that they were wrong twice. Okay. Chogan King 666, what are the projected models for a certain model or getting a beat up in the near future? Well, no, I mean, people are already furious, and the longer this goes on, the angrier they are going to be. I mean, there are people who think that, okay, it's going to get back to normal like real soon now. And well, it's not, certainly not in most places in the Western world. And, you know, when people lose hope They will turn to anger. And in that regard, Marshall McLuhan said that violence was the search for identity, and I was asked to comment on that. And let me give you an example. It's been said many times that the West can inoculate Muslims against terrorism. That just being in the West, we have all these great consumer goods, and women wear yoga pants and tight tops, and we have porn and strip clubs and lap dancing. And so Muslims in the West, they are going to be seduced by this, and then they're going to put Islam aside. Well, let's look at the 9/11 hijackers. We know that a great many of them fully partook in the decadence of the West, and that did not stop them from blowing up the World Trade Center and partially blowing up the Pentagon. And so I think that in this case, the 9/11 hijackers, their exposure to the decadence of the West made them more likely to be terrorists than, say, those Muslims who lived a more traditional religious life. Because, degradation leads to shame, and shame often leads to a dissolving of the personality. What sort of person am I? And a person who felt that their life as a Muslim, their self-image as a Muslim had been besmirched. Well, what's one way to get that back? Well, to commit a terrorist atrocity. In fact, if we look at so many of these Muslim terrorists in the West, they are Muslim in what way? Do they pray 5 times a day? Do they follow rules against alcohol, pork, and the like? Do they go to mosque? Well, no, a great many of them do not. A great many of them smoke dope and do other things like that. And yet, this leads them to a point where they need to reassert their identity. And violence is a way to do that. That we hear now the fellow who killed over 20 people in Nova Scotia, and we're not supposed to use his name. Well, this fellow was a wannabe. In his high school yearbook, he had talked about becoming a policeman. He never became a policeman. He did buy old police cruisers at auction and had them made up to look exactly like police cruisers, and that he even got himself a uniform, much like the police wear. And so eventually, he ends up in a killing spree. And clearly, at least to me, this is a case of violence being a quest for identity. I don't, again, we see this. We see this over and over again. This is what McLuhan said in a 1977 interview. All forms of violence are quests for identities. When you live out on the frontier, you have no identity. You are nobody. Therefore, you get very tough. You have to prove that you are somebody, so you become very violent. Identity is always accompanied by violence. This seems paradoxical to you? Ordinary people find the need for violence as they lose their identities. It is only the threat to people's identity that makes them violent. Terrorists, hijackers, these are people minus identity. They are determined to make it somehow, to get coverage, to get noticed. And he was asked, and all this is somehow a symptom of an effect of the electronic age? And McLuhan responded, no. But people in all times have been this way. In our time, when things happen very quickly, there's very little time to adjust to new situations at the speed of light. There is little time to get accustomed to anything. Even radio has sent tribal societies around the globe up the wall with intensity of feeling. One of the major violence makers of our century has been radio. Hitler was entirely a radio man and a tribal man. McLuhan was asked, then what does television do to tribal men? McLuhan said, well, I don't think Hitler would have lasted long on TV. Like Senator Joe McCarthy, he would have looked foolish. McCarthy was a very hot character, and like Nixon, he made a very bad image on television. He was far too hot a character. He would have been much better on radio. McLuhan made a distinction between hot and cool media. Radio, hot. Newspapers, hot. Films, hot. Television, cool. Part of the, I think that has changed radically in recent years, because listeners to this live stream who are old enough will remember what television used to look like. It used to be black and white, for a start. And it was on TVs that were 20 inches and in a 4:3 aspect ratio, very low definitional. Before cable, the signal was not secure, that it would flip both vertically and horizontally, or you'd get wavy lines, or you'd get snow on the screen. And McLuhan was absolutely right when television was the age of mass consensus. That, again, you can see this if you follow political conventions, that someone goes out and, onto the stage and gives a barn burner of a speech, and old-fashioned kind of speech. And this riles up the delegates. But the people in the booth who are watching on monitors, they didn't think it was a very good speech. They thought it was over the top. Similarly, when a speaker, let's say a nominee, gives a speech at a convention, and it is a speech designed for television, the reaction from the people that are right there is muted. But then we find out that the people who watched on television like this a great deal. But again, those conditions have changed because television is high definition now. You've got a ratio of 16:9, which is more like human vision. You've got your 1080p. You've got 4 HD now. And one of the results of this is that television has become much, much hotter. If you compare talk radio with talk TV, well, talk radio was always hotter than talk TV, but talk TV has become as hot as talk radio. Of course, in the internet, being largely print-based, the internet has revolutionized politics, because the internet tends to favor hotter speech rather than cooler speech. So let's have a little more from McLuhan. He said that we now have the means to keep everybody under surveillance. No matter what part of the world they are in, we can put them under surveillance. This has become one of the main occupations of mankind, just watching other people and keep a record of their goings-on and invading privacy. Yes, McLuhan said, in fact, just ignoring it. Everybody has become porous. The light and the message go right through us. At this moment, we are on the air. We don't have any physical body. When you're on the telephone or the radio or on TV, you don't have a physical body. You're just an image on the air. When you don't have a physical body, you're a discarnate being. You have a very different relation to the world around you. I think this has been one of the big effects of the electric age. It has deprived people, really, of their identity. And of course, McLuhan died before the internet, but he pointed us in the direction that things were going. Now we live virtual lives, and in this lockdown, we are encouraged to live entirely virtually, that our only contact uh, with the world outside is the delivery man who leaves your boxes of food outside your apartment building. Concerts have become virtual. Church services have become virtual. Everything has sexual intercourse or forms of thereof have become virtual as well. This deprives people of their identity, and so they seek to reassert their identity through violence. So, Tom Anderson says Stanford is losing a lot of credibility during this crisis. Mr. Dalmatia says, enjoy the wipeout of the middle class. And again, I think that this could well be part of the plan, because the middle class throughout the West has woken up to the fact that they are under assault from the high-low alliance, from the 1% and from the people who get the gibs, the favored people. And they fought back against this. They fought back with Brexit. They fought back with Trump's election and in other ways. And globalism was becoming exceedingly unpopular. But now, of course, we have global experts who tell us that, yes, the economy must be smashed, society must be totally atomized, and our civil rights must be stripped. Okay. Alex Delarge says, what people like KMG don't seem to realize that it's possible to accept the medical facts while opposing specific mitigation measures. Look, the final straw for me was when New York decided, oh, we need 3,800 extra bodies. Okay. Yeah, we're just going to add them to the list just to keep the panic factor high. That was absolutely it for me. And then it got worse. We learned that the government wants patients' death certificates to say that people died of COVID-19 when, one, they weren't tested, and now not even symptoms. So, no, my disdain of experts could hardly be greater than it is right now. So, again, from Summit News, UK, figures from the Office of the National Statistics show that the number of deaths from flu and pneumonia is 3 times higher than the total number of coronavirus deaths this year. How about that? The figures show that there were 18,500 total deaths in England and Wales in the week up to April the 10th, which is around 8,000 above what would be considered normal at this time of year. Around a third of those are linked to coronavirus. But the figures for 2020 also show the impact of flu and pneumonia compared to coronavirus, reports the BBC. The number of deaths from flu and pneumonia at more than 32,000 is 3 times higher than the total number of coronavirus deaths this year. The report points out that the 18,500 death figure is the highest since January 2000, when there was a bad flu outbreak. The number of deaths recorded in the week up until April 10th in 2015, where there was also a particularly deadly flu season, is also relatively close to the number of recorded coronavirus deaths in the same week this year. Back in February, a leaked government document suggested coronavirus would infect 80% of Brits and kill 500,000. So far, the number of coronavirus deaths recorded by hospitals across the whole of the UK stands at 17,337. Supporters of the lockdown policies assert that social distancing measures have kept death numbers relatively low based on what was previously predicted. Others point to the fact that NHS hospitals are 4 times emptier than normal, and overspill hospitals built to prevent existing hospitals from being overwhelmed were never used to complain. They were never used. And this leads to suggestions that the coronavirus threat was exaggerated. Whatever the case, the British government has not indicated when it will start to lift lockdown measures, despite other European countries already beginning to relax them. Oh, a second wave of the coronavirus is expected to hit the United States next winter and could strike much harder than the first, because it would likely arrive at the start of influenza season. Yeah, Watson had mentioned this earlier. What are they saying here? That I get the impression that all respiratory illnesses are going to be classified as COVID-19 deaths. Even if there's no testing, even none of the other symptoms of COVID-19 were not present, all respiratory deaths are going to be COVID. And of course, what that means is you can't go back to normal. Nope, that world is over. It's over. So Peter Hitchens said that if you had a king, a medieval king, who forced his subjects to stay in their homes and forbade them to work, forcing them to become his debtors while their crops rotted in the fields, you'd think he was a tyrant. This was in response to someone who said, no justification to call this tyranny, reminds me of Braveheart, just with Netflix and Amazon instead of horses and swords. Liberty is bad, apparently. We can't have liberty anymore. And I suppose what's shocking is just how easy it was. Just send out a press release. There's an article here in Public Discourse, the Journal of the Witherspoon Institute by Lyman Stone. Lockdowns don't work. That simple sentence is enough to ignite a firestorm of controversy these days, whether you say it in public, to someone at least 6 feet away, of course, or online. As soon as the words leave your lips, they begin to be interpreted in extraordinary ways. Why do you want to kill old people? Why do you think the economy is more important than saving lives? Why do you hate science? Are you a shill for Trump? Why are you spreading misinformation about the severity of COVID? But here's the thing. There's no evidence of lockdowns working. If strict lockdowns actually saved lives, I would be all for them, even if they had large economic costs. But put simply, the scientific and medical case for strict lockdowns is paper thin. Now, I mean, we talk about lockdowns, but as I mentioned before, yeah, if everyone was forbidden to leave their homes and apartments and the governments dropped off supplies, that would be one thing. But we have people going to all manner of stores. We still have people walking on the sidewalks in many places. So they have been exposed to the coronavirus. Oh, yes, it was this strict distancing. Well, go to a grocery store or go to any other kind of store. This strict distancing is simply not possible. People are going to pass and do pass within close proximity. So this is a very long article, which I commend to you. It's at thepublicdiscourse.com. And the author goes through what happened in France and Lombardy and Spain, and points out that we've seen this all before. Again, from Spiked, Wilfred Riley, there is no empirical evidence for these lockdowns. Just 7 weeks ago, one of the USA's better quantitative scientists, John Ioannidis of Stanford, made a critically important point. During the coronavirus pandemic, we are making decisions without reliable data, he said. Now, the people who attack Alex Berenson say, well, are you an epidemiologist? Are you trained in STEM? And they do this in order to avoid people like Professor Ioannidis, and there are quite a few like him. These people just get ignored by the mainstream media. There are plenty of certified experts who say loud and long that the lockdown is a terrible mistake and will result in more lives being lost than otherwise would have been the case. As Ioannidis and others have pointed out, we do not even know the actual death rate for COVID-19. Terrifying and widely cited case fatality rates, like 3%, come from comparing known fatalities to the small pool of people who have been officially tested. Those test cases are mostly made up of sick and symptomatic people or those who had direct contact with someone known to have had COVID-19, rather than to the far larger pool of people who may have had a mild version of the disease. Because of the same denominator problem, we also don't know the true infection rate. A recent German study indicates this could be as high as 15%. Finally, we do not seem to know the effectiveness of the various strategies adopted by national and regional governments to respond to the disease, ranging from the advocacy of social distancing to full-on lockdowns. As a professional political scientist, I have analyzed data from the Worldometer's coronavirus project, along with information about the population density, median income, median age, and diversity of each U.S. state, to determine whether states that have adopted lockdowns or shelter-in-place orders experience fewer COVID-19 cases and deaths than those which pursue a social distancing strategy without a formal lockdown. I then briefly extend this analysis to compare countries. In short, I do not find that lockdowns are a more effective way of handling coronavirus than well-done social distancing measures. And as of 6th April, 7 U.S. states had not adopted shelter-in-place orders, instead imposing social distancing restrictions, such as banning large gatherings and mandating 6-foot spacing gaps and maximum customer limits within all retail stores. Those 7 states are Arkansas, Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, and Wyoming. These states reported 1,620, 2141, 952, 343, 1311, 2542, and 288 cases of COVID-19 respectively as of 16 April, for an average of 1,321 cases. They also reported an average of 22.3 deaths. Throwing in South Carolina, which did not adopt a shelter-in-place order until April 6th, it still allows most religious services, does not dramatically alter these figures. These states averaged 1,613 cases and 33 deaths. So we're all going to die, apparently, and these states, which are full of deplorables, they didn't follow the expert advice, so they're going to be devastated. No, they were not. A disturbing story from CNN today. The world is facing multiple famines of biblical proportions in just a matter of months, the UN has said, warning that the coronavirus pandemic will push an additional 130 million people to the brink of starvation. Famines could take hold in about three dozen countries in a worst-case scenario, the executive director of the World Food Program said in a stark address on Tuesday. 10 of those countries already have more than 1 million people on the verge of starvation. He cited conflict and economic recession, a decline in aid, and a collapse in oil prices as factors likely to lead to vast food shortages, and urged swift action to avert a disaster. As we know, those people who are skeptical about the COVID-19 panic are accused of being indifferent to human life. You might want to rub this into them. That, again, as I've been pointing out for weeks, for months, if this continues, we're going to be looking at a massive Malthusian die-off. And maybe that was the plan all along. From The Spectator, Frederick Eriksson, the Swedish experiment looks like it's paying off. 2 weeks ago, I wrote about the Swedish experiment in The Spectator. As the world went into lockdown, Sweden opted for a different approach to tackling coronavirus. Cities, schools, and restaurants have remained open. This was judged by critics to be utterly foolish. It would allow the virus to spread much faster than elsewhere, we were told, leading to tens of thousands of deaths. Hospitals would become like war zones. As Sweden was 2 weeks behind the UK on the epidemic curve, most British experts say we'd pay the price for our approach when we were at the peak. Come back in 2 weeks, I was told. Let's see what you're saying then. So here I am. I'm happy to say those fears haven't materialized, but the pressure on Sweden to change tack hasn't gone away. We haven't U-turned. We're careful, staying inside a lot more, but schools and shops remain open. Unlike some countries on the continent, no one is asking for our papers when we move around in cities. The police don't stop us and ask why you're spending so much time outdoors. Authorities rather encourage it. No one is prying in shopping baskets to make sure you buy only essentials. The country's public health agency and the state epidemiologist Anders Tegnell have kept their cool and still don't recommend a lockdown. So why isn't Sweden changing tack in the fight against the pandemic? The evil that is in the world always comes of ignorance, wrote Albert Camus in The Plague, a book that eerily depicts the suffering of the human condition when a disease sweeps through society. Yeah, everyone, in effect, people were cheering for Swedish people to die. That'll show them. Let's have a big die-off in Sweden. Yeah, you know who else is dying because of COVID-19? People with heart conditions, people having strokes. This is from the New York Post, which first brought attention to this story. New York State officials have scrapped controversial new guidelines that directed emergency service workers not to attempt to revive anyone without a pulse when they arrive on a scene during a coronavirus pandemic. State Health Commissioner Dr. Howard Zucker rescinded the do not resuscitate order put out by his Bureau of Emergency Medical Service on Wednesday, just hours after the Post exclusively reported on it. This guidance, proposed by physician leaders of the EMS Regional Medical Control Systems and the State Advisory Council in accordance with American Heart Association guidance and based on standards recommended by the American College of Emergency Physicians and adopted in multiple other states, was issued April the 17th at the recommendation of the Bureau of Emergency Medical Services and reflected nationally recognized minimum standards, the health department said in a statement. However, it added they don't reflect New York standards, and for that reason, DOH Commissioner Dr. Howard Zucker has ordered them to be rescinded. Yeah, it's a controlled die-off, but it might get out of hand. Breitbart has an interview with Kristi Noem, who's the governor of South Dakota. This is one of the states without a lockdown order. She said that despite earlier projections of a surge on the hospitals in South Dakota and nationwide, no, we haven't seen any such a surge. In fact, South Dakota has, again, without a lockdown, cut that number down by 75% of its projections, which with much less 100 people in the hospital, much less than 100 people in the hospital. According to the state's Department of Health, there have been 1,858 cases of coronavirus in South Dakota. 937 people have recovered. There have only been 9 deaths, and there are 62 people who are currently hospitalized. In total, only 111 people were ever hospitalized for coronavirus in South Dakota, far less than ever was expected. And she says, I've been super proud of what the people in South Dakota have done. They've recognized that I wasn't going to dictate to them, that I valued their freedoms and liberties, and that I was going to let them take action of their families and on behalf of their families and communities. When asked how she made her decision to not issue a closure of businesses in South Dakota and to not issue a statewide stay-at-home order like many other governors did when the crisis was beginning, she told Breitbart that she was focused on providing the best and most scientific response. I looked at our state and our people here and knew they would take on the personal responsibility that would be necessary to protect their families and their communities. I'm not one who believes in a one-size-fits-all approach. And even in South Dakota, I've got pretty diverse communities. I've got some that are pretty sparse with not many people, and then I've got some that are big cities as well. So I wanted to leave some flexibility there for local folks to make decisions, but also recognizing that when it comes down to it, that these guys had to take on the personal responsibility that is necessary to really go after this virus. Reuters reports Georgia tests boundaries of life post-pandemic with risky reopening. Yeah. Is there any human activity that is not associated with risk? No. Yeah, let's go after Georgia here because they decided they're not going to bring all life to a halt. Now, if we're looking at the big picture of the pandemic here and what was what is it attempting to bring about, this is horrifying and rage-inducing. Again, from Breitbart, a Chinese manufacturer is donating drones to police departments across the United States so agencies can better surveil citizens they suspect are violating social distancing orders. Shenzhen-based DJI Enterprise recently donated monitoring equipment to the Battle Creek Police Department and Kent County Sheriff's Department in Michigan, where that frozen-faced woman, Gretchen Whitmer, is governor. Wood TV reported on the manufacturer's website DJI uses examples of police agencies like Daytona Beach, Florida, who plan on using the drone's loudspeaker to disperse crowds to avoid the spread of COVID-19. As far as patrolling the streets and shouting messages, that's not what these are for, Kent County Sheriff's Department Lieutenant Joel Roon told the news station. The drones are smaller than the current fleet and are equipped with a light and a speaker The decision to accept the drones was based more on an opportunity than a specific mission. Yes, an opportunity. Rune said the drones will not be used to monitor crowds that may be violating Governor Gretchen Whitmer's stay-at-home order yet. Well, the drones can spot things like body temperature and illness. I don't know, maybe just have the sky full of drones and suddenly, I don't know, it'd be like that Spielberg movie, Minority Report, that a drone could tell you that, I don't know, you're smoking. Why are you still smoking? Or you're eating too much, you're eating the wrong food, or you too much alcohol. Oh, apparently you're not getting enough exercise. Now, of course, exercise is kind of banned, but maybe you want to do push-ups at home. Again, from Summit News, Steve Watson, tech companies rushing to develop AI social distancing enforcement tools. As PC Plods in the UK and Keystone Cops in the US continue to bumble around trying to operate Chinese-made drones, numerous tech companies are developing more sophisticated tools that will allow Big Brother to more effectively police social distancing rules. Californian software developer Landing AI has created video surveillance software that watches people and sounds the alarm if they get too close to one another. Are they trying to incite a revolt, a revolution? Kind of seems that way. Landing AI explained that their system works by using an artificial neural network to detect each person and puts them in a box. Then if two boxes get too close to each other, they change from green to red. At that point, it will be up to the police to send in compliance robots, kill squads, or whatever they have decided we deserve. A similar technology is already being introduced by Amazon in its warehouses, with the company threatening workers with the sack if they violate social distancing guidelines. Police in Westport, Connecticut are also going to be testing a pandemic drone that monitors citizens' temperatures from almost 200 feet away and detects sneezing and coughing as well as heart and breathing rates. The war against the drones, that is coming real soon now. So, of course, President Trump announced immigration restriction this week to the delight of some and to the horror of others. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas seems to think that the president has not gone far enough. Interviewed by Tucker Carlson, he said it doesn't make sense to allow companies to bring in foreign IT workers given the current unemployment situation, that Americans need to get jobs rather than bringing in massive amounts of workers. He said, why, when you have the highest unemployment rate in our lifetime, would you allow companies to import IT workers from foreign countries to take middle class or upper middle class jobs? That seems insane to me. Sorry, that was Tucker Carlson who said that. Cruz responded, I agree with you. I don't think it makes sense. We have 22 million Americans who have filed for unemployment in the last 4 weeks. The whole purpose of legal immigration is supposed to benefit the economy. When you have 22 million Americans out of work, they need to get jobs. We don't need to be bringing in a million plus workers when 22 millions are out of work. Yes, but of course, I suppose it's a question of pay and working conditions that the tech companies have got used to, pulling every single computer science grad out of the country of India, or in all those people who pretend to be computer science grads. I'll get to the Pope in a minute. 2 British men arrested for posting pubs closed, borders open stickers. The stickers, another of which said open border virus disorder, were posted on lamppost bins, bus stop signs, and bollards around areas of Sheffield. They are believed to be the work of the 100 Handers group, described as far right by the BBC. Police said 2 men, aged 20 and 22, were held on suspicion of racially aggravated public order offenses and have now been released while investigations continue. Local councillor Miskell said the stickers were an affront to diversity. This is absolutely disgusting and comes at a time when our diverse community is busy working together to tackle the virus. This sort of behavior can damage community cohesion and relationships across the city. We're all working together to try to combat the virus. The immigration continues and the pubs are shut. Can't say that because it's a crime against diversity. Yes, it's not possible to be guilty of crimes against diversity. Of course, immigrants come to the United Kingdom from all over the world. The assumption that the immigrants are all non-white is not true. For instance, there has been an enormous amount of immigration from Poland, which is very much a white country. So this isn't necessarily a racial thing, but it makes no difference. Immigration has become kind of a religion. Toby Young writes, why is there, this is from his lockdownskeptics.org blog, why is there a furious row about the government's failure to secure more ventilators when the evidence is clear that ventilators are largely ineffective at treating COVID-19? According to this letter published in The Lancet, 86% of patients put on mechanical ventilation in a Wuhan hospital died. An earlier study put the figure at 97%. For patients facing certain death without ventilation, there's an argument for intubation, although it may just speed their demise when palliative care would be more appropriate. But for those not facing certain death, there's mounting evidence that mechanical ventilation does more harm than good. This is the kind of gotcha journalism that has seen the public's estimation of my profession plummet during the crisis. I don't mean to single out the Financial Times, by the way. Nearly all the papers have the story. Yes, you'll remember ventilators. We don't have enough ventilators. How can we get more ventilators? Who's responsible for not having enough ventilators? Was the question asked? Are ventilators some sort of miracle cure? No, the question was not asked. This was simply another way for the media to score points off Trump and Boris Johnson. The Telegraph leads with the shortcomings of the PCR test given to almost 100,000 NHS and social care workers and raises the possibility that some could have been given the green light to return to work when they were still infected, thanks to the high incidence of false negatives. Several think tanks have come up with exit strategies. Guido Fawkes has a summary. He also flags up a new report from the Center for Policy Studies showing the government borrowing this year will rise from £55 billion to approximately £300 billion, representing 15% of GDP. That's money that will have to be paid back in the form of higher taxes and spending cuts. As Fawkes says, we need to end the lockdown before this climbs even higher. Well, higher taxes in the United States are not very politically popular, not at all. And we've got gambling, high taxes on tobacco and alcohol and the like, I suppose, because it's just thought to be politically suicidal to raise income tax rates. But again, what's the alternative to that? One reader has read the proposals for lifting the lockdown to the Treasury Select Committee and comments. They both claim that lockdowns have been proved to work to control the virus. How can they be so sure as economists? They are both fully signed up to the doomsday predictions of mass death without a lockdown, and that saving the lives of people who would otherwise die of COVID-19 is far more important than getting the economy restarted. There's talk of a tracing app being essential as we go forward, with zero mention of the impact, from what I can see, on civil liberties. Further lockdowns can't be ruled out, according to them. No diversity of opinion or critical thought. Overall, rather depressing stuff. Oh, yes, and how are affluent white female liberals taking this? Can you guess? They're not taking it very well. 2 months ago, Harriet Walker was a career woman with a novel on the way. Then her daughter's nursery closed and her former life vanished overnight. This is in the London Times, and the headline is, "It's like The Handmaid's Tale, How Lockdown Turned Career Women into Reluctant Stay-at-Home Moms." Let's see, it begins at the end of February. I was having dinner in Paris and feeling pretty smug. I was there covering Fashion Week for the Times with my first novel out in July and the manuscript of the next almost ready to send to my editor in New York. I was 8 weeks pregnant, too, a sibling for our 2.5-year-old, whose early years have been a breeze thanks to her sunny temperament and my husband's preternatural talent for dadding. Ah, it was during my first maternity leave that I started writing my book. In my head, I had already been planning the next. But then disaster happened, and this is, particular disaster for AWFLs that cleaners, no cleaners, can't get a cleaner anymore. Not an essential service. I suppose there's always the possibility that the writer, the novelist, could do some cleaning. But Dad apparently is staying at home to look after the children. I have actually done that, and I do not recommend it. There are, I suppose there could be some men who would be good at this, and it wouldn't drive them crazy. But I don't think that there are very many at all. It's not work for a man, and it has terrible effects on both the man's self-esteem and on the way that the wife or partner looks at the husband. It greatly lowers his status. To say that the coronavirus crisis, this silly woman writes, has been living the Handmaid's Tale, is at once a wildly self-indulgent exaggeration and exactly how I feel some mornings. When I realized that lockdown meant that the cleaner couldn't come, it was clear I was living through a dystopian nightmare. She followed up on this subject. Some people were applauding her. Some people were not happy with her essay. And I tweeted her, "So this wasn't a parody?" And she immediately blocked me. I used to think that the sisterhood were the women on Twitter who campaigned to put Jane Austen's face on a tenor. Now I belatedly realize it is the women I used to be able to outsource my feminine mystique to. A very strange man called Farhad Manjoo writes in the New York Times, 2 parents, 2 kids, 2 jobs, no child care. Apparently, Farhad Manjoo has a wife and children. I was a little surprised by this because I looked him up on Wikipedia, and I'll read, okay? He was a staff writer for Slate from 2008 to 2013, went to the Wall Street Journal in 2013, to the New York Times in 2014, and has been a contributor to National Public Radio since 2009. He was born in South Africa in 1978 to a family with ancestral roots in India. A cisgender man, Manjoo prefers to be referred to with singular they pronouns. In his final column for Slate, he urged men to wear makeup. And there's a picture of him here from 2008 where he looks very silly. Indeed, he has dark skin, so I don't know whether he is in fact wearing makeup. But yes, things are starting to break down. I don't just mean psyche and soul and social bonds and sense of self. I mean ordinary overworked things around the house: the dishwasher, the garage door opener, the fridge door, the faucet in the kids' bathroom, the towel hanger in the kids' bathroom, the toilet in the kids' bathroom. Don't ask. Bodies, too. So far, we've had a sprain. Our 9-year-old apparently attempting the land speed record on a scooter meant for a toddler, a possible fracture. Him again attempting same on a bicycle after dark, and enough stress-induced gastrointestinal distress to burn out the poor plunger. His house sounds really smelly. For a school diary entry, our 7-year-old recounted how, during an overly raucous, parentally imposed game of chicken charades, she brutally bit into her lip, resulting in the world's biggest canker sore. Yeah. See what's going on here? This is more manufactured consent. That, sure, it's tough. Sure, it's tough. Working from home, that is for people who can work at home. And the confinement is cloying, but I'm a celebrity, or at least a media celebrity, and we're going to get through it. We're getting through it so all of America can get through it. You know, he's from the leadership class, and so he's in a position to know about such things. So the Pope, who any day now I'm expecting the Pope just to, just come out and just say that he's a pagan, because he's making it pretty clear. Pope Francis issued a severe indictment Wednesday of humanity's failure to care for the planet as environmentalists commemorate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Because of our selfishness, we have failed in our responsibility to be guardians and stewards of the Earth, the Pope said. We need only to take a frank look at the facts to see that our common home is falling into serious disrepair. We have polluted and despoiled it, endangering our very lives. For this reason, various international and local movements have sprung up in order to appeal to our consciences. I deeply appreciate these initiatives. Still, it will be necessary for our children to take to the streets to teach us the obvious. We have no future if we destroy the very environment that sustains us, he said in a message evocative of his past praise for climate warrior Greta Thunberg. We have failed to care for the earth, our garden home. We have failed to care for our brothers and sisters. We have sinned against the earth, against our neighbors, and ultimately against the Creator, the benevolent Father who provides for everyone and desires us to live in communion and flourish together. Sinned against the earth. That is very much a pagan view, and of course it was this Pope that had pagan idols put in churches in Rome, and when they were taken out and thrown into the Tiber, they were retrieved, presumably at great expense, and then put back on the altar. Is the Pope Catholic? The old joke goes, no, he is not. Jesse James Decker defends walking around in underwear in front of her kids. I'd never heard of this woman. This is a strange picture of this woman in, not much of underwear and a t-shirt. She's holding a big glass with red wine in it, and her child is in the background of this picture. The photo in question features the mom of three lounging at home with a glass of wine in hand, wearing nothing but a t-shirt, black underwear, and slippers. The 32-year-old son, Eric, can be seen in the background. Decker, who is married to ex-NFL player Eric Decker, found support in some followers who called the quarantine pick a mood. Others questioned her for not covering up more around her young children. You walk around like that with your kids around? Asked one follower, to which Decker replied, yes, no different than a swimsuit. I teach my children the body is beautiful, nothing to be ashamed of. Decker also responded to a troll asking if she is desperate for attention. Yeah, I don't get enough love, she replied sarcastically. Can I get a hug? I suppose, it's one thing to be slovenly around one's children, but she insists on broadcasting it to the entire world. As I like to say, social media was invented to drive women insane. There's a good article in the Tablet by Lee Smith. China Queen Dianne Feinstein used her Senate power to push most favored nation status for the CCP's corrupt dictatorship. And why? And then he talks about, other people who were responsible for this. George W. Bush, Henry Kissinger. Of course, Dianne Feinstein benefited personally by rare earths mine shutting down, the leading supplier of rare earths, and so that's all China now. And her husband benefited greatly because of this. Feinstein had, a spy on her staff. She has her own Gulfstream, which she flies from San Francisco to Washington. Must be nice, huh? Okay. More Americans have negative views of China than ever before. Let's see, 66% are now saying they have negative views, up nearly 20 percentage points since the start of the Trump administration 2017, according to a new poll by the Pew Research Center. This is higher than at any time since Pew began asking the question in 2005. Positive views of China's leader, President Xi Jinping, are also at historically low levels. While China's handling of the virus may have made an impression on some Americans, it does not appear that escalating conditions in the U.S. over the course of March shifted attitudes toward China during that period. The New York Times reports that Chinese agents spread messages that sowed virus panic in the U.S. American officials were alarmed by fake text messages and social media posts that said President Trump was locking down the country. Experts see a convergence with Russian tactics. They're just not going to let go with this Russian nonsense. They're just not going to let go. The Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, has arrived at the very strange conclusion that coronavirus has made them more secure and has improved their position in the world. Very, very strange people. Peter Brimlow, the founder and editor-in-chief of VDare, comments on Trump's immigration announcement. He talks about his long history, 25 years to the month since I proposed an immigration moratorium in my book Alien Nation, and 28 years since I first broached it in my 1992 National Review cover story. So I wasn't unmoved to see a president of the United States finally adopt the idea on Monday night. Nor, again, because it has been 25 to 28 years, am I particularly moved now to see the executive order promptly watered down by the usual suspects and savagely denounced by Tucker Carlson. I've been waiting a long time, and I've learned patience. The key point: unlike the 2008-2009 Great Recession, when incredibly the idea of an anti-unemployment immigration moratorium literally never entered the heads of key policymakers, the idea is now, as they used to say on Wall Street of a company that had attracted a takeover bid, in play. It can be extended and expanded. It can no longer be ignored. Also gratifying, Trump's now famous tweet specifically citing the need to protect jobs rather than sticking to the easy option of keeping out disease. To judge from the aftermath of the Great Recession, unemployment will be with us long after the disease has subsided and depressed wages even longer. The next step, to point to the political advantages of an immigration moratorium, that it will stop the left from entrenching itself by electing a new people, as Hillary Clinton openly planned to do in 2016. The heroic Michelle Malkin has recently made this argument, saying, do the math. Of course, the true conservatives believe that, no, got to appeal to the minorities. The minorities don't like the Conservative Party for obvious reasons, because it's white people who vote for the ostensibly conservative parties, and it's minorities that vote for the others. But no, let's just bring, it's like the old joke. We lose money on each sale, but we plan to make it up on volume. That's how the true conservatives think. Nancy Pelosi was carrying on about ice cream. It's a strange woman as well. And she was attacked with an amusing video from the Trump campaign, which was applauded by none other than Meghan McCain. I don't know whether you know this, but Meghan McCain is the daughter of the late John McCain. It's nice to know that she doesn't, attempt to trade on that. The View host on Tuesday called an ad from the Trump campaign mocking the moment, the kitchen freezer moment, a kill shot, and advised Pelosi to avoid comedy shows amid a pandemic. Pelosi talked about gourmet ice cream you can get through the mail while sitting in front of a large refrigerator while being interviewed by CBS Late Late Show host James Corden last week. They're traps, McCain said of late night shows for politicians. They get you to say things there because you feel you're being funny. Leave it to the professionals and don't go on comedy shows. Yes, I've seen it, the video, and it looks silly. McCain said it's not the ice cream in her fridge, it's the fact that she's standing behind giant refrigerators, multiple ones, that cost $24,000 each. And you're right, Joy, politicians are wealthy, Trump is wealthy, but I think in this specific moment, optics are narratives. Oh, and Trump has announced he's brought back the Trump boxes. the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, $19 billion aid campaign to deliver healthy food to Americans, fresh produce, dairy, and meat. Okay, so let's take a look at what is, oh no, I wanted to mention this from the New York Times. Fed up with online harassment from conspiracy theorists, the performance artist, Marina Abramovich, breaks her silence about the treatment she's faced. I need to open my heart. I really want to ask these people, can you stop with this? There's an article about her on Vigilant Citizen. She is the spirit cooking guru. And this article has a number of lurid photographs. To promote its mixed reality device, HoloLens 2, Microsoft teamed up with a prominent occultist to create an art project called Life. In a promotional video posted on Microsoft's official YouTube account on Good Friday, Abramovich is described as the most legendary performance artist working now. The art project consists of people wearing the HoloLens device to witness a ghostly version of Abramovich appearing out of nowhere while walking around wearing a symbolic red dress. She says that this project allows her to attain a form of immortality. Yes, here's a picture of Abramovich in Elle magazine. She holds the head of a goat by the horns, representing the drawing of power from Baphomet, while wearing a red dress, symbolic of the transformative powers of occult ritual and sacrifice. In recent years, she became mostly known for inviting John Podesta to one of her spirit cooking events, which involves lots of bloods and other bodily fluids. Now, they provide videos and photographs. There's Marina Abramovich and Lady Gaga at an event that took place at Watermill Center in 2013. In this picture, they stand before a woman lying in what it looks to be a pool of blood. Guests scooped that blood with spoons to eat it up. The event was dubbed Devil's Heaven. In another Abramovich event, guests wear lab coats as they partake in mock cannibalism. In yet another event, hosted by Abramovich, a cake in the likeness of Blondie's Debbie Harry is cut up and eaten by guests. If that's what they do in public events, one can only wonder what they actually do behind closed doors. Yes, and there's a picture of her wearing a black jacket. There's a naked boy, I don't know, 8 years old, in front of her. We see him from, the breasts up, and she is covering his eyes. And the caption says, dust. So we have an open Satanist who's complaining that people are being mean to her. Well, Exodus chapter 22, verse 18. Let's look at Saskatchewan. 320 cases, 4 deaths. There's 1.1 million people who live in Saskatchewan, and yet this ridiculous lockdown continues. British Columbia, 87 deaths, 1,724 cases, although that may have increased. 3 more dead. Okay, 71 new cases. And as always, I'm going to check the figures for Vancouver Island, which is where I live, which has almost 800,000 people. 1 new case, up to 110 cases. And Justin Trudeau's handling of COVID-19 lifts him to his highest approval level since 2017. The Angus Reid Institute finds that 54% of Canadians now endorse him, a 21-point increase since the end of February. We'll see how long that lasts. Trudeau has given indications that he believes the lockdown should continue until there is a vaccine, and that could literally be years away. Canadian economy was already in very grave trouble before COVID-19, and it is going to be broken by this. Chad Chadson says, of Marina Abramovich. She coached Lady Gaga, Taylor Swift, and Miley Cyrus. Jim Smith says, I have bought Dove bars and Talenti gelato, 2 items in the refrigerator that weren't mentioned in any of the commentary. Oh, Chogokin666 says, Pelosi is adorable, funny, and highly relatable. She was a cute young lady, no doubt about that. Yes, absolutely true. As was the Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. British American says, Kevin, have you considered moving to Monday, Wednesday, Friday format? No concern about quality here, just worried you might burn yourself out. Well, I have to fill up the days somehow, you know. I found that it's gotten easier, actually, the longer I've done it. You know, it's like anything else, you know. You struggle to find a routine, to find a rhythm. It seems overwhelming at first, but I've got better at it. KMG, you have to learn screen sharing, says David Wright. Yeah, you're probably right about that. Tom Anderson says the real idols in the Vatican weren't the Pachamamas, but the idols of globalism and diversity. Of course, John Paul II famously allowed St. Francis's own church in Assisi to be desecrated with pagan idols, not once, but twice. The church was later destroyed by an earthquake, you know, which might have woken some people up, but not the Vatican. I wonder how this is. Bob Paxson says the Pope is not a pagan, he is a communist. He is known to have been a great admirer of Juan Perón. He was the man who wrecked Argentina, and a ferociously anti-Catholic politician. Oh, Chogo King 666. They are petite bourgeois, but they worship the lumpen while serving the oligarchy. Philip Daniel says, I was hoping that ID poll and wokeness would be weakened by the crisis, but it seems I was very wrong. The fragile are infected by an anti-fragile ideology. It's really too early to say. It really is. Because if this lockdown continues for much longer, large numbers of people are going to snap, or they're going to start to revolt. That these drones are going to be shot out of the skies, just to give one example. And the way that the way that the British police have carried on, apparently they seem to have little concern for how their actions could possibly affect their safety. Anyway, that's all for today. I want to thank you all for watching or listening, and or both. If you like the show or any part of it, I would appreciate it if you would click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. If you would like to support this program, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. I'll be back on the air at 4 p.m. Pacific time tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And I will leave you with the benediction, as always, that in these times of total atomization, I sincerely hope that you all manage to find some actual human contact. Bye-bye.